It's great to see everybody here in person and over Zoom. I'm Quentin Sedlacek, and I'm an assistant professor of STEM education over in the Department of Teaching and Learning. And my work focuses, I was a K-12 science and math teacher for 5 years and did instructional coaching in schools. So my work focuses on how adult educators in science and math and language arts and other fields sort of become really attentive readers and listeners. So like really attentive to their students' thinking and how that shapes not only sort of what we understand about what students are thinking and what students know, but also how that shapes students' perceptions of us. And then there's sort of social motivations to engage in different tasks in classrooms. So I feel very loud talking about this. I know that folks might not have their cameras turned on, which is totally fine, but I'm wondering if everybody could close their eyes for just a moment and raise your hand if you've ever submitted a paper that got rejected. Hands back down, eyes still closed. Raise your hand if you've ever submitted a paper that got a revise and resubmit. Hands back down, eyes, eyes open at this point, I guess. So question for everybody. Of those papers, the one that got rejected versus the one that got a revise and resubmit, I presume there was at least a little bit of feedback on each of those. Not very much. But which feedback do you feel sort of more motivated to respond to? The feedback on a rejection or the feedback on an R&R? Turn to the person next to you, or me, and explain why. Take about 30 seconds, just explain why one of those feels sort of more compelling to respond to than the other. If you're joining us online, please type in the chat. Why would you respond more to an R&R than to just a flat out rejection? Take about 30 seconds. Yeah. You're not a lost cause. Sure. Okay, so one of those things is not like the other. One of those things is more motive. And what I'm going to talk about mostly during my time today is about the fact that feedback occurs in a context, right? So like we can give use, there are lots of specific things we can do to make our feedback to students useful. And we can also do things around and sort of before giving feedback that create conditions where students are most likely to do something with it and respond to it. And so, for example, my number one suggestion to create tasks that students are likely to respond to feedback on is to make tasks iterative. So, for example, in my courses, this is a rubric from one of my PhD classes, but I use something almost identical with my undergraduate and master's degree courses as well. And what I try to do is design assignments where it is not possible for students to get a perfect score on that assignment the first time they turn it in, because responding to feedback is sort of part of the rubric and part of what's expected of them. So students can turn something in, maybe they can get a 9 out of 10 on that first try, but there is an expectation set from sort of day one of the course that if you turn this in, then I will give you feedback on it. And then you should respond to that feedback in some way. Even if it's like just like a small follow-up comment, a small thing students might add later in the course. The point of this is to create a classroom environment where responding to feedback is not seen as sort of something extra or optional. Getting feedback is not seen as like a failure, right? But it's an experience to be learned from. And so, admittedly, this means that you're going to look at every assignment twice. And so it will take longer than looking at every assignment once. You can sort of make it pretty small, right? Like students have to add one comment in response to your feedback or something like that. So maybe it only takes 20% longer, but that means I might give 4 assignments instead of 5 in a given semester.
I'm going to zoom out of the camera because you're getting cut off over there.
Sure thing. Okay. And please feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions that you might have. There are other ways that we can create an environment in which students are going to be likely to respond to feedback. There's a whole bunch of sort of writing to learn research across a bunch of different disciplines. And so we can give students open-ended tasks, right? Questions or writing assignments that have sort of more than one valid response. One easy way to sort of take an existing assignment that might sort of have a right answer, right? Or a sort of narrow range of right answers and open it up and expand it is to ask students to write for an audience other than me as the instructor. So a whole bunch of research at the K-12 level and a sort of expanding body of research at the college level that if I, as the teacher, ask students to write something for me, especially in a science setting, but in other disciplines as well, many students might sort of come into class with the expectation that they're sort of supposed to regurgitate like what it is they learned in class or tell me sort of what they think I want to hear. If you prompt students to write for a different audience, like their younger sibling who's back at home, or a parent or a guardian or a friend, right? Maybe they still write that explanation for you, but then you ask them to write another explanation for somebody else. And there's a lot of research that suggests that like students are sort of interested in doing that, right? They've often not been asked to do that very much before. And it causes them to sort of draw connections between the content that they're writing about, the content they're learning in class, and the content they already know. So like pushing somebody to say, explain mitosis to me. Now explain mitosis to your 10-year-old sister at home causes them to think more about sort of what mitosis means, how it works, and to draw connections that are likely to result in transfer of that learning to new contexts. And there's sort of a bunch of different ways to do this. I can happily share the slides later. I don't need to stand here and prattle about them too long. Another suggestion when it gets to actually giving students feedback is to use rubrics to clarify expectations and guide feedback. So, clearly state what's expected of students, give them time to read your rubric and discuss it with each other before starting an assignment. And one thing I like to do with my classes is to give students, what's happening here? Is to give students anonymized copies of work from previous years and have them work in pairs or in small groups to use the rubric and grade last year's papers, right? Just a couple of them to give those students, basically every time somebody gets an A- on a task in my class, I say, this is so great. Here's some feedback. Here's how you can improve it. Also, is it okay with you if I cross out your name and use this with next year's students? And every year, a couple of people say yes. And so the following year, I have students delve into that work and make sense of sort of what is being asked of them as an in-class activity. So that when they get that feedback, they know how to respond to it. And that also often helps them sort of evaluate themselves and like anticipate, what grade they're going to get and what feedback their instructor might give. Last two things, and I don't want to eat up too much time, so I'll be quick. One is to give when you're actually sort of writing feedback to students. Close your eyes again, please. And raise your hand if you've heard the term wise feedback previously. Okay, hands back down, eyes open. So it's a bunch of research on this, some of it happening sort of in writing studies, and a lot of it happening in social psychology about this sort of catch-22 or Goldilocks problem where when students get positive feedback, especially sort of quick, good job, sort of feedback they might see as superficial, sometimes students take that good job and they appreciate it. Other times they take that good job and they think, wait, I cranked this out at 1 o'clock in the morning. It's not my best work. Does my instructor have low expectations for me? On the other hand, overly critical feedback can also lead students to fear that their instructor has low expectations or might even be biased against them, right? So there's a lot of work on this at the K-12 level. Students of color might worry their instructor is racist. Female students might worry their instructor is sexist. Those are rational concerns because people are racist and some people are sexist. And even though we are not, our students don't know that, right? They don't know what's going on inside our heads. And so when we give them critical feedback, they can end up afraid that we're giving them that feedback for some reason other than we think will help them learn. And so we got this not too positive, not too negative. How do we find this sort of Goldilocks zone in the middle? And it turns out the solution is to maybe not worry so much about finding the Goldilocks zone, but to think about sort of the way that feedback is framed and couched to students. And so wise feedback has been sort of repeatedly experimented on and researched for the past 15, 20-ish years. And that is to sort of give students specific and critical feedback accompanied by a statement such as, I am giving you this feedback because I have high expectations and I believe you can achieve them. And what that does is sort of reframe for students the idea that like, oh, my teacher wouldn't bother giving me like all this critical feedback if they didn't think I could do something with it. Right. It's sort of like reframing, not this teacher thinks I'm so horrible. They like put all this, red ink on my paper, but my teacher thinks it is worth their time to invest in giving me suggestions and helping me meet their high expectations. Now, importantly, this research has been replicated numerous times at the K-12 level and has shown to be effective, but a recent attempt to replicate it at the college level found that it was just less helpful for undergraduates. And some follow-up qualitative work found that this appeared to be because course assignments sort of like undercut this message to students. So if students, they were given a bunch of critical feedback and they were told, I'm giving you this feedback because I believe in you and I think you can do well, but then they don't actually have a chance to do anything with the feedback, right? Like that's the only time they're ever going to see this assignment and they don't get a chance to make it up or anything like that, then students sort of don't believe that sort of phrase coming from instructors. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to start with talking about creating a classroom context in which students know that they're going to be asked to iterate and to respond to their instructor's feedback over time. Last thing I would say is to audit our feedback to students. And so this is actually something my dissertation work focused on several years back. But essentially, for a wide variety of reasons, we have lots of papers to grade. We get tired. Some students' work strikes an idea in our head and we write a bunch about it. And then the next student's work, we're sort of a little more exhausted. And we might not think of all the same things to say or to write. And so it turns out that some students, especially ones who maybe are struggling in class, sometimes get like a little bit less feedback, even if that's just because like that happened to be the last student's paper that we graded at the end of a very long day. And so one way to address this is literally just to grade all the papers and then take an extra 20 minutes to just skim through them really quick and see which ones got more feedback and which ones got less. Find one paper that didn't get very much feedback and just write a few extra comments on it to ensure that everybody is sort of getting that sort of the best of you, because a lot is asked of you as instructors. You're working really hard. And so this is just a tiny way to make sure that that one student who might have missed out on some comments because you have 200 students and you're exhausted, this is one way to help that one student get a little more useful feedback that one time. So lots of ideas, lots of suggestions. I know I've said a lot and I don't know much of anything about the contexts that you're teaching in or what your classes are like. So some of this suggestions might not be terribly useful. I hope that at least one or two of them are. Thank you so much for your time.
I'll just use that.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
I think the feedback is that look at my but I'm not.
No. Okay. Sorry. So I'm just going to exit out. Is that
You
okay?
can exit out and then do the stop share. So don't share.
And then. Okay, hi, my name is Missy Lawrenson. I am a senior lecturer in the writing and reasoning program, and I teach first year writing. Most of my research and studies have looked at transfer theory, how students can transfer from one knowledge from one context into another. I also do a lot of work with student reflection, metacognitive learning, and through the reflections, interesting enough, I do get a lot of feedback on the feedback that I give students. And so some of what I am discussing today is informed by that feedback. I also have do a lot of research. I feel very strongly about the writing process, as it is a process of drafting and revising, and that there is really no finished product. Ask Walt Whitman with how many editions of Leaves of Grass he has, that there's always something that we can do to improve a piece of writing. And so taking that knowledge into how we're teaching students writing and how we respond to it is kind of where I'm coming from. And so when you're looking at feedback and giving written feedback, something that I like to ask, or you wonder is like, why am I giving this feedback? What is the purpose of that feedback? So I'm curious, for those that are here, if you could put in the chat or even share, like when you have given feedback, what was the purpose of giving that feedback? To correct something? Oh, yeah, to correct something? Okay. Anybody else?
Guide the students.
Guide the students. When you say guide the students, what do you mean by that?
You can unmute yourself, Susanna, if you want to.
Giving them an opportunity to kind of like see what the right path is. If they have written something and maybe it has a grammar mistake, I can guide them saying, well, this is a grammar mistake, rethink your grammar. If it's a problem with the logic, I can make a comment, and then that comment will guide the way they need to improve.
Perfect, thank you. Help them polish up a skill. Yeah, and I think that kind of goes along with what Susanna was saying about, help them improve with your logic and help them, fix grammar like we're polishing things. Or develop a skill. Yeah, I think, having this in mind, really helps us frame the kind of feedback that we give. Sometimes, so some of the things that I also thought about is the purpose of giving feedback, is to look at content knowledge as we are looking at their feedback and looking at their writing is how are they representing the knowledge that we're asking them to represent? So if it's a critical thinking class, are they showing critical thinking skills? If it's a history class, are they showing that they understand, that they understand the content that we're asking them to analyze? Their writing skills, going to the grammar, are they clear in the sentences that they are writing? Do they have a lot of grammar mistakes? Are they using formal language, or do we see nowadays all over the paper? How are we helping them enter into the academic conversation and then analysis and critical thinking skills along with content, knowledge. Are they also showing those critical thinking skills and logic, as Susanna has said, as they are, entering into this conversation? And so my next question, I guess, is then when do you usually give your feedback to the student?
Traditionally is on the final product, traditionally, right? But what you should be doing is in different steps, scaffold the process.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share? Often it is the final product because, we're like, hey, we have this assignment. Here's this assignment. You're going to fill it out. I'm going to grade it. I'm going to justify my grade and give you the feedback. And then you go along your way, which traditionally that is what we have seen. However, my recommendation is that there's more feedback that is helpful for students as we think about the writing process in early drafts, rough drafts, where they're just starting to frame their ideas. Once they frame those ideas and they have a pathway where they're going, then we have maybe second or third drafts. And then the final draft. So the reason why the final draft is in quotations is back to what I said at the beginning. There really is no such thing as a final draft. There's always something that we can go back and improve, and helping students understand that is that you're not turning in a perfect paper, because a perfect paper really does not exist, but yet this is an abandoned draft. I have no more time to revise it. This is the best that I have up to this point. And the feedback that we give with all of these three stages, if you're able to incorporate these three stages into your class, should look different with each stage. And so we have summative feedback, which purpose is to assess performance. And this is the traditional final draft feedback, is we are assessing your performance and we're giving your feedback based on what this final draft has presented. Or we have formative feedback. And this is the type of feedback that encourages revisions, where we see early drafts, rough drafts, and second and third drafts. And so I would encourage, in order to really have effective feedback to students, if you can, make sure you give opportunities for this formative feedback, even if it's just one draft before the final draft. Because again, if we give formative feedback on the final draft, coming back to what Brittany said, the students are like, I don't know what to do with this because I've got this grade and you told me how to fix it, but I don't have an opportunity to fix it. And even to see if the way I fixed it was correct, it goes in one ear and out the other. And then they get a new assignment and they're not able to transfer the knowledge of their writing skills from one assignment to another. And so this can be really helpful in building at least a draft into the process.
May I just
Yeah,
make a
yeah.
comment? Something that you said that I never thought about is, and it's so true, it feels like the feedback on the final draft seems to be the justification for the grade, right? And that the feedback on the early drafts are to encourage the student to like correct a path or fix something. And I was like, I never thought in these terms, but it's like, that's exactly what it is.
And helping that students understand that, right? So the feedback that I give, I mean, and I'll show you some examples, but the feedback that I give on a final draft, I'm really looking at, hey, tell me more, you know, we need to do this, your thesis says this, but I see your paper doing that. There's this disconnect. And how can you improve that disconnect, right? And then the feedback on the final is the rubric says this is how you performed, and this is why you received the grade that you did. And so the feedback's going to look different in that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So when you're looking at feedback with early drafts, my recommendation is you want to start, you can't give students feedback on every little thing that's wrong with the draft. Some of the stuff that's wrong with the draft on their early draft does not matter. Grammar does not matter on a first draft. That's my perspective. Some might agree, but it doesn't matter. I'm not going to have a student fix grammar on a first draft when they might eventually take that entire paragraph out of the paper. It's a waste of time. On that very first draft, I want to look at global issues. What's the thesis? What's the main argument? And what does the paper actually argue? Does it represent content knowledge, right? Are they making an argument that can be made? Are they, you know, or are they saying one thing in their thesis and another thing in their paper? Nothing else matters if there isn't a clear thesis and a clear focused argument. So any feedback I give on source integration, any feedback I give on paragraph format really doesn't matter for that assignment for that student. And so first, you want to look at focus, accuracy. The feedback that you give should be directed toward that, because I think of it as if anybody played a musical instrument or, you know, kind of. I used to teach piano a long time ago, and I would teach to young students, and I would assign a piano piece, and a student would come and they would play the piece. Maybe they would have a couple notes wrong, or they would have the beat wrong, or they would have the tempo, I can't think of the word, crescendo wrong, the sound, you know, how loud or how soft the music is. I can't tell the student, you got to fix all of these things right now. I start with the most important thing. We got to get the notes right. You know, you know, this is a C, not an F. And fix that first. Once that's fixed, okay, now let's move to the tempo. You can go faster now because you have fixed this core issue and you move up that way. So when you're looking at giving feedback and helping students progress with their writing, think of it that way. Like, what is the most crucial thing that they need to fix? And then how can you build on that? And so my early drafts, I'm looking at thesis and argument. The next draft, I moved down to more focused local feedback, source integration, and paragraph focus is usually where I go to next. How are students integrating their sources to support this big idea? The paragraphs, are the paragraphs themselves focused? Do we have topic sentences in those paragraphs? The argument within the paragraph itself, is it fully developed? So you're able to move further that way. So some key points to also take away, move from there. Students often get overwhelmed with feedback, and we cannot comment on every issue within the paper. And so we have to decide which issues are we going to address. And if the student has repeated issues, highlight one and say it repeats throughout the essay, and don't highlight every issue in the essay. And I'll have an example that I will kind of show you in a little bit. Focus on major issues first, allow students opportunity to revise, then you can comment on more local issues. If they're, again, repetitive issues, point out one, but then let the student know that the issue repeats throughout the paper. So it gives the students opportunity to notice when they're making that mistake, which helps them in future writings, and then they can fix that mistake. So here's some examples of what I would say is effective and less effective feedback. So less effective, this literally makes no sense. That's not really effective for a student. You're gonna feel like this big. But something that you could say, you know, is like a template, really, is this is an interesting point you make about blank. I'd like to hear more about blank. What part of this does what you're saying that? Because if we say, hey, you need to explain that more, the student thinks, I did explain it. That's why I submitted it, right? And they don't know how to fix it. So asking questions that direct students how to fix the issues can be really helpful to students. And so this is something that I have used before. Another wrong. This is the wrong interpretation of Blake's text. Did you even read it? Again, like if a student misinterprets a text, point out that, hey, I think there's a misunderstanding here, but then encourage them to go back. So something you could say is, I encourage you to revisit Blake's text. Pay close attention when he discusses blank. So point out the part in the text that maybe the student has misunderstood. It seems that you misunderstood his key point. So you're not saying, it's just saying the same thing, but in a different way to where it's a growth mindset, right? So you're encouraging the student to go and to seek out that knowledge and give them the opportunity to improve it. Another less effective, good. Good job. This is good. Kind of going back to what Quentin said at the beginning. Well, what about it is good? If it isn't good, point out what they do well. So then they can mimic it and repeat it in other parts of the essay. So one of the things that we look at a lot in first year writing is source integration. How are they introducing their sources? How are they explaining their sources? And how are they engaging with their sources in the paper? And sometimes students do really well, and sometimes they don't do so well. So what I'll do if I see a student really utilizing good source integration, I will say, hey, what you did right here, this is what we want. Do this with your other sources. So, you know, you do a really nice job of introducing your quote. What you say here helps the reader understand the full context of the quote. You also explain the quote. We can see what you take the quote to mean and how and why the quote is relevant to what you say in this paragraph. Pay attention to what you do here and apply similar concepts to your other quotes. So this is a way of helping the students see not only did you do good, but what you did well. And that is what, and it gives them confidence. They're like, oh, I can do this. I did this here. I can do it again. And you don't need to comment on this on every single thing that they do well. So I'm not going to say this on every single quote that they do well. I'll say, hey, this is really good. You do it. You'd also do it well in a couple of your quotes, but a couple of your quotes, they need more of this. Review your quotes. Notice the ones that are well, and then choose the ones that you want to fix. Another, less effective, analyze more. Sometimes students, again, thought I analyzed enough. Like, what more do you want? More effective. I encourage you to spend more time explaining what the quote itself means. Explain in your own words what blank means when they say blank. So instead of just saying, analyze, give me more, tell me more, ask prompting questions that help students figure out, oh, okay, well, I can do that. I can tell you about that. I can explain more about that. Less effective, fix your grammar. More effective. This is mostly effective if a student has a repeat grammar mistake, you know, like a sentence fragment or a subject-verb agreement. Is you identify the grammar mistake and you take a second to explain the grammar, because sometimes students, they don't even know what a sentence fragment is. And so saying this is a sentence fragment, the sentence has a verb, argues, but it is missing a subject. We don't know who is arguing. Remember, every sentence needs to have a subject, verb, and a complete thought. I noticed that there are several sentence fragments throughout the essay. I have highlighted a couple, but I encourage you to go back through the paper to locate and revise them. So you identify the one, explain what it is, maybe highlight another one, fragment, but allow the students the opportunity to go through, reread the paper, and locate places where other fragments are. This encourages learning, and it'll stick with them. Because if we just edit the paper for them and say, okay, go and make these changes, they're not gonna end up with the grammar. But if we ask them to go and notice places where there's mistakes, it's going to click. And then when they write again, it'll be better for them. Here's another one, less effective, develop your argument more. Again, I go back to the students, they want to be successful. They think that they're developing their argument. And so here, I like the point you make here about blank. Do you think it can also be blank? How do you think it could connect to blank? Asking prompting questions to deepen their thought, to promote the, deeper thought and deeper analysis through questions as if you are having a discussion with the student in a classroom. Here, your argument is wrong. Again, when you say blank, are you saying blank? First, ask for clarity. If so, you will need to explain more about how and why blank is true. I'll share a quick example. I had a student that had a really good essay, and there was a paragraph that made an excellent point, but it had nothing to do with the rest of his paper. And, my first thing is like, this paragraph doesn't belong, right? But instead I was like, okay, tell me more about why you chose to include this paragraph. Because right now, I don't see that it fits. So either explain to me how what you say here is connected to the rest of the paper, or save this really good paragraph for a different essay. The student revised the topic sentence and the connections, and it was the coolest connection I have ever seen. Like, I was like clapping as I was reading the paper. I was like, oh my gosh, I would have never have seen that connection. So sometimes we are tempted to project onto the paper what we think the student is saying or what we think the student should say, and we're taking away their voice when we do that. And so if something doesn't make sense or we don't see the connection, take a second and ask, hey, where is that connection? Why did you choose to put this here? So the student can then think, oh, I just didn't make it clear. So they take a second to make that clear. So key points. Writing is an active conversation. Feedback to students should also be a conversation. And that feedback is extended teaching. It's an opportunity to continue to teach something that you started in the classroom. Many students have traumatic experiences with writing and feedback. I see this a lot in the reflections that they have been destroyed, honestly, in high school, and sometimes even within other classes, that the feedback has just been so damaging that they fear that they tell themselves they're not good writers, right? And that they can't learn to be a good writer, which is heartbreaking from a writing perspective. So due to these experiences, they often lack confidence. And the feedback we give, we need to give corrections and guidance, but build their confidence as we do that. Because the more confident a student is in their writing, the better their writing is. And again, it can be easy to project our own thoughts and ideas into student writing. So asking students to explain their thought process will help instructors understand what the students really want to say, and then we can guide them to say that. Again, with summative feedback. So most of that is formative feedback, right? Because we're asking them to tell us more. We're asking to fix things. With summative feedback, use the language of the grading rubric. You're justifying the grade the student received. Encourage students to continue working on specific writing skills. So even though it's summative feedback, your language can be in the future when you are asked to write again with sources. Make sure and so you're giving them like general feedback, but pointing toward another assignment. So it's not like this feedback is for nothing, but it's like, okay, I can take this feedback and transfer it to something else. Point out what the student did well. Welcome questions or concerns. So if we tell our students, hey, if you have a question about anything that I said, make sure you come and ask me. We think it's obvious. It's obvious. I have office hours. Come see me. But sometimes students need that invitation of, hey, come talk to me about these questions. And even though it is summative feedback, it should still help the students think about ways to improve their writing. So that was all.
Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead, Gabrielle, if you have a question. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Thank you, everyone. I just had a quick question for both of our presenters. So obviously this is a lot more efficient, but it's also a lot more time consuming for the instructor, especially if you're teaching multiple sections with a large number of students and things like that. So what I've been doing is using the audio feedback feature that we have in Canvas. And I was just wondering what your own personal views are on that. But I'm also interested in whether there's any research that tells us what students' experiences, reactions, preferences are when it comes to audio as opposed to written feedback. And I'm assuming some sort of, relatively typical situation, obviously not feedback that is non-native speech, that it's highly accented and unintelligible and things like that.
So I'll speak first and then I'll turn it over to you. So I'm not aware of studies or research that has been done on the audible feedback, but I do know there are a few professors in my department that use it, and it does save time. From what I understand, that it has been received by the students, but I don't have any personal experience or knowledge on the research, but it definitely is. What's nice about it is the student can go back and replay it and they can listen to it. So I would argue there's a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not familiar with research on it, but I'm here to go and then look it up. Great question, Gabriella. So, yeah, I've been on the receiving end of audio feedback in graduate school, and that was very helpful. And we have that as a tool, but the questions you asked are great one, and I go with them. It's irrelevant to my. So, you're okay if that's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, not just the audio, right? There's the video feedback they provide, which particularly for online education, that's really impactful because it's a way for you to have instructor presence. And as you are recording the video, if you're looking straight into the webcam, it gives the student a sense of you're looking straight at them. So the brain kind of doesn't know the difference that much. And so that could be beneficial, even if you were speaking in our language at SMU, we have Canvas, right? We have the speed grader. We might be able to put those written notes right beside that video feedback. And I think the combination can be very effective.
Yeah, I agree. We hold conferences with students in the writing department, and they'll come and they'll sit with us, and I'll go through the essay with them and they'll read it with me, and I'll stop and we'll talk about it. And that video feedback, you can mimic that, and that could be really helpful with the comments. And I will say, I utilize SpeedGrader in Canvas. As you can see, there's kind of a little bit that I write, and it's hard to handwrite that. And so, in my handwriting can be hard to read. So I'll highlight the section that I'm pointing to, and then as a comment, I will type that in so the students know exactly what I'm pointing back to.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much, the presenters.
My only question is, how do you come up with the time to give such specific feedback, specifically on yours, that is like, okay, good work on this paragraph. It's not so good. And then bad work on this paragraph is also not so good. And then you have to tell me more about blank, explain more about this. How do you connect this to this? Like, I think that is really effective. I just worry, like Gabriela, that it takes so long to give this feedback that it becomes a bit inaccessible for our professors.
Yeah, I totally empathize, and I think that's a very reasonable concern, and one of the reasons why I think I realize sometimes those concerns are sort of beyond your control, but I give sort of fewer assignments in my classes as a function of sort of how much feedback I expect to give to the students. But also one thing I imagine, I don't sit here and stuff you already know or you already thought of, but we'll often see sort of the same issues arise in students writing over time, or the same issues across the assignments. And so for each of my assignments, I have a little sort of library document with snippets of feedback I've given to students in the past years. I'm able to create little templates, right? So that when this particular issue arises, I don't have to sort of type out all 200 words of it. Maybe I only have to type out sort of half of it because the framework is already there. I really loved what you showed, Misty, about pointing out where a student's idea is not clear, right? Like ask them to elaborate, right? The sort of template that is like, I think you were saying this, but I wasn't sure. Are you saying something else? Like either way, like clarify that point, and then I can just sort of type in a little bit of text. It doesn't fully solve the problem, but it does speed things up a bit, and I'm sure you have more.
Yeah, no, that's a, well, I don't know if I had this on when I was talking. I hope, oh my gosh, I hope you guys could hear. I'm okay. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's is excellent concern, right? And it's taken years to kind of figure out how do I, manage that. And I go back to one, you cannot comment on everything in the paper. That would take hours. And so choose the most important thing, maybe 2 or 3 things that you want to look at to give the student to go back to and to revise. I do a lot of drafting in the class, and I'll assign a paper, and then I'll have something in between a draft and I'm like, hey, work on this as we're doing that. So I do have time in between drafts to kind of look at it and give it. And it's easier to give formative feedback than summative feedback. It's easier for me to say, hey, you got to fix this than justifying the grade. It takes me longer sometimes to do summative feedback. And I tell them, I'm not telling you everything I see wrong. I'm pointing out the most important things. And so kind of triaging, I guess, in a sense, what are we going to work on here, and using time in class to talk about it. But my recommendation is choosing the most important thing and focusing on that, and it's hard for some instructors to not comment on everything, but just say, you know what, just because I'm not commenting on everything doesn't mean it's not there, but this is what I want you to work on. So and hopefully that's helpful, but utilizing the audio can allow you to do that much quicker.
Thank you. Susanna?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of like comment on Constantine question. That is, I think it's an excellent question. And some of my response is kind of in something that I think resonates what Misty was saying, is kind of being very intentional about what my goals are to the students for each one of the drafts. So for instance, I'm teaching a psycholinguistic class, and actually in the first draft, I don't even ask the students to write the paper. What I ask them is to give me the topic sentence of each one of the paragraph, give me the supporting sources, and give me the logic, but don't write it out. Just give me the skeleton of your paper. And then on the second draft, I work on something different. I work on the sources. How are you going to explain the sources? So I'm very specific about what my expectations are for each one of the drafts. And then that it allows me to kind of give them more specific feedback when I'm reading that, having not to worry about grammar, about other things, that it will come later. It will come later, and then I can kind of be more specific about those. So that was my question comment.
Thank you. Gabriela?
Okay, so I have a very specific question about correcting grammar. So, Misty, you said a while ago that, when you see a fragmented sentence, then you're going to give this explanation that, a sentence should have a subject, verb, object, and so on and so forth. And so there was a nice chunky paragraph that you included there. And I suspect also that in English, you get more mistakes. Possibly, I'm guessing. I don't teach English, that pertain to organization, maybe style, but in world languages, we see a lot more that pertains to grammar. And so I think that we're also inclined to mark all those instances. And so my specific question is this. So obviously, I don't want to do the work for them. And so when I see the verb that it's in the wrong tense, I'll circle it and I'll put a T above it, right? And then the student makes the correction, but typically there's 2 to 3 drafts in the class, rather 2 drafts and 1 final draft and 1 final version. And so then when I say T, they have the legend, right, and they know what they need to change, but then they will select the wrong tense. So instead of, let's say I wanted them to use a pluperfect, but they ended up using, I don't know, a preterite. When in the original it was a present tense. So what would you do with instances like those? Would you do something else instead of just saying T for tense, or because I feel like that particular mistake doesn't lend itself well for the explanation, the nice explanation that you had for a fragmented sentence.
If I understand correctly, what you're saying is that like a student will have something in the present tense and they need to fix it, but the tense that like past perfect or past tense or whatever, there's a very specific tense that you need them to have in that language.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Yes, yes, but they just choose a different tense, right? So it's not a present tense anymore, but it's also not a preterite. Let's say they use whatever other tense, let's say pluperfect.
Got it. So would be my understanding. I'm not a language expert by any means, but I would say that my assumption would be that the student doesn't understand. They see tense and they think I just have to change the tense, and they change it to whatever tense, but clearly they're not understanding the reason why they would need to change it to the specific tense that you want them to. And so I would say that instead of just on one, not the whole thing, but if they have multiple instances where there's tense issues, I would explain to them this is present tense and it should be in this tense because, and so they see it on the one and then say you have similar mistakes throughout and then go fix that. And I don't know if that is something that's realistic that you could do, but that's how I would approach that, to give it a teaching moment to be able so they know exactly, oh, it's not this tense. I need to do it to this one. And this is why. And then they can figure it out with the others. I hope that helps.
Yeah. This is a great question. And I too am not a second language acquisition expert by any means. But one thing I would think of is, especially if you see this as sort of like a recurring problem, with like an individual student's recurring problem with a semester, or maybe it's a problem for a lot of students, maybe, relatively early in the term, you let students know that you're also going to ask them to not only sort of like fix a grammar mistake, but like explain sort of how they fixed a grammar mistake, right? And so like on every assignment, one of the times that you pointed out the tense, you write an EX next to it, and they have to turn in like a brief explanation of like what they changed it to and why. And like the students might then sort of put more thought into changing it, or they might still get it wrong. But if every child, they're adults, if every student in the class does that, then you maybe have another corpus of data to say like, oh, actually like 12 of my students are really struggling with this. I should give them all like an extra little task, or we should spend 5 minutes on it in class or something like that. Just sort of like prompting them to engage in like a little bit of extra metacognition if you're worried that like just telling them to change it's not enough because they might change it to the wrong thing. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, and if I could add, that encourages conversation, right? Because then you're making sure they saw your feedback and then they're commenting on that as they're explaining, I changed it to this and this is why. I love that. I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I love the metacognition bit. I just think that certain grammatical structures lend themselves better for that approach than that, just because for the first bit of the answer, which was, mark it here and then, ask them to go through the rest of the paper. I think that works better for some structures, not others, because, verbal tenses are really one category, but we lump into that category many different tenses that are not interrelated. Sometimes some instructors will, also add the category of aspect and mood and whatnot. But yeah, I see your point. Thank you very much for both of your feedback.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.